And I'm absolutely delighted to be co-hosting with ADM+S, led by Christine Parker as one of the chief investigators, who has long been a colleague as an expert in the regulatory study space, particularly regulatory compliance and enforcement. We've both been kicking around for a very long time, so it's the first time we've actually co-hosted a party together. It's a particular pleasure to introduce Christine Parker so that she can introduce our special guest. Christine, thank you.
It's lovely to be here and co-hosting a party. And I'm delighted to introduce Professor David Levi-Faur from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, from the Department of Political Science and the Fetterman School of Public Policy. He's going to be giving our keynote speech this evening. As Karen wrote in her introduction to the program for today, David's energy, enthusiasm, expertise and commitment over 4 decades, it's not 4 decades as in 40 years, but it is actually over 4 decades if you count the 2000s, whatever. And I've been around for all of them too. Anyway, his commitment over 4 decades has been absolutely foundational to the field of regulatory studies. And he's just been amazing at creating and supporting communities of scholars, paying attention to junior scholars, being interested and curious about the research that everybody is doing, and creating forums and platforms for regulatory studies scholarship. So David co-founded the leading journal, Regulation and Governance, and has worked indefatigably to make it a successful platform for a scholarly and practitioner community in regulatory studies that really values excellence in research, and anybody who's been through the review process of regulation and governance will know what I mean. It's not unusual, anyway, to have several reviews and several revise and resubmits. It's all good. But always quick. Similarly, for many years, he chaired the ECPR group on regulatory governance, which is one of the most important forums for exchange in regulatory governance studies. He's edited and co-edited several leading texts in the fields of regulatory governance, and is particularly known for his own work on regulatory diffusion and comparative political economy, varieties of regulatory capitalism, and then more recently for his work on regulatory intermediaries. He's had numerous visiting positions and honours at universities all around the world, including the Australian National University, where we first met in the 90s, I think. And he's currently working on a marvellous and well-funded European Research Council project on regulatory trust. So over to you, Professor Levi-Faur.
Thank you very much. What a lovely introduction, a long one. Thank you very much, Christine. Thank you very much, Karen. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm going to speak very shortly, 60 minutes only, before you get your dinner, right? 60 or let's do it 20. So take 20. Take 20. And the topic is really regulation and trust. And let me say here also that I was influenced by many people. But one of the leaders and the most inspirational person I met in the field is John Bracelet, who brought Christine and me together and probably influenced others in this room. John was and still is an amazing scholar who moves from across the law and the social sciences in elegant and fantastic way. Is the father of the compliance pyramid or the responsive regulation, among other things. and this work is really also influenced by him, but also by a scholar called Michael Moran, political scientist who died a few years ago, who wrote in few, just in passing, review paper and few sentences on the relations between the regulatory state and trust. And he asks something like this: is the regulatory state a low trust state? Question mark. And the idea that you can really look at the rise of regulation, the explosion of regulation and its relation to trust is the standard at the core of my project and my presentation today. So I don't know if you probably know that regulation are all over us, from the left and the right and the top and bottom. We are living in the age of regulation. Maybe not enough regulation, maybe too much regulation, maybe both too much and too little. But this is the world of rule. This is the world of rules and implementation of rules and monitoring of rules and so on. But what do we know about the relation between trust and regulation? This is what I'm trying to speak about. Today, many of the things are intuitive and make sense when you hear them, but I think they do not influence the research agenda. So some things may sound trivial for you on the relation between trust and regulation, but when you look at the research design, the way we do empirical research, you don't see these trivial ideas playing in. So that's the agenda. So I will speak about issues like to what extent regulation and trust compete, substitute, or mutually enforce each other. What are the relations between the two in what we call liberal democracies, or democracies in general, and to what extent the movement from, or the shift in some countries, in some arenas, from liberal to illiberal society affect the relations between trust and regulation. In between, I'm bringing the idea of intermediaries who are central to the assurance regimes, and intermediaries are kind of a sub-party. So you have the regulator, regulatee, and you have the third party, the intermediary. And the intermediary do the certification, ranking, auditing, etc. So today, for those of you who were today in the workshop, this was about assurances, and I think much of the assurances is being done via the kind of thinking about intermediaries. But I will return to this soon. I want to start with a tale, a realistic fantasy. About what? Imagine Trustland and Regland, two countries, imaginary countries, on the two distant islands near the shores of the continent of liberal governance. Trust is the currency that shapes the interactions among the citizens and rulers of Trustland. Regulation is the currency that governs the relations in Regland. Commitments, incentives, and norms are all about trust in Trustland, but are essentially meaningless in Regland. They are simply not useful in Regland because you have the rules, not the trust, and the opposite in the other island. So think about this kind of political community, social community that stand on trust in Trustland. The first article of the Constitution is trust and be trusted. But on the other end, in Regland, regulations are the currency that define the Constitution, and the Constitution starts with regulation. Obey, participate, give legitimacy to rules, make sure that the main values like solidarity, equality, freedom are really constituted by rules, covered by rules, constituted by rules. And those imaginary countries lived for a long time on different sides of the oceans, but climate crisis, financial crisis, populist backlash, drug addictions, pandemics, and white-collar crimes hit both countries or both arena. And they were trying to deal with all those kind of issues. Each country with its own mechanisms, trust or regulation. No success. And then came the idea, not least because the grass of your neighbor is greener. Trust lender wanted regulation, and regulation people wanted more trust. They understood that they have a limitation with both regulation and trust. They cannot really rely only on those. And those, after some kind of discussions, protests and so on, they established the new republic. A republic which is common to both countries, islands. They call it the Republic of RegTrust, regulation and trust. RegTrust. We have a new union of RegTrust. But how to make it work, right? Traditions matter, institutions matters, interests, ideologies, all those kind of things that comes from the two different wonderful countries. Think about Britain and France, or Britain and Germany. You know, they need to work together. And they found a solution. They found a solution which I will call building your institutions via intermediaries. So you take third parties into your institutional design and ask the intermediaries to make sure that regulation and trust will work. Use intermediaries as agents of trust. If you want, in the language of today, agents of auditing, or agents of assurances, agents of accreditation. And in this way, not only stabilize the governing system of the two islands, but also make it more effective and kind of overcome the weaknesses of trust and regulation at the same time. So the story goes and goes, and it's a good story. It's a good story about the ability to combine trust and regulation in a democratic setting, in democratic system of governance. I call this kind of tale a realistic fantasy. But if you think about what we did in the last, say, 70 years in the post-war period, it's kind of a democratic miracle. And I will argue that it's built for a large extent on the ability to combine democracy, trust and regulation together via administrative systems of balancing both sides, balancing interest, balancing trust and regulation. And of course, intermediation plays an important role in this process. So it's really optimistic tale about what we achieved. This is perspective about democracy in the last 70 years, despite neoliberalism, despite that most of the democratic achievements are confined to the west or to the north. And I think these techniques doesn't have any techniques of governance does not have any real alternative. So I'm optimistic also about the future, including when I see semi-proto-fascist, fake news, populist, etc. Okay, so this is where I'm coming from. But why buy what I'm telling you today? This kind of presentation was not prepared for you. It's coming from my research for a while now, 6, 7, 8 years. And when I was today with you, speaking about assurances and models of assurances, and see their weaknesses, and also how they are spreading, diffusing, etc., makes me believe that there is something in what I'm saying here, that we achieve effective governance with assurance, not with hierarchical controls. And those assurance regimes allow us to decentralize governance in a way that we don't have to rely only on the rule maker, because relying only on the rule makers and the rules that comes from the state are dangerous for what? For liberal governance, and also to the issue of self-regulation. We need some space for trust. We need some space for self-regulation in order to continue liberal governance. We cannot really put all our eggs on the state. And we do it with those intermediaries. Who are those intermediaries? What do you say? So as any one of you, instead of going and maybe any one of you, I don't know, but instead of going and reading my work on intermediaries and my kind of summaries of what intermediaries are, I went to the AI software. I asked in this case, BARD, B-A-R-D, .google. This is the chat GTP of Google. And I said, what do intermediaries do? And he gave me an answer. And because it is an AI, he didn't ask me David, you really means regulatory intermediaries or just intermediaries? Just intermediaries. The first time I say intermediaries are in marketing and sales, they are in distribution, they are in finance, they are in risk management. Bart gave me the example of banks, etc. Banks are intermediaries between savers and lenders, right? Or lending people. So I asked him, what do regulatory intermediaries do? And he knew the answer. Like they provide legal advice, they provide assurance, they provide indicators of performances, they allow you to audit, they allow you to monitor, etc., etc. But he didn't really understand that intermediaries allow us to move from government to governance, from centralization of power to this decentralization of power. This is something that I knew and I want to remind you. And they provide expertise, they save time, they give you peace of mind because you don't have to check everything. You have a third party who check it. And they allow kind of, again, decentralization of power and so on. So this is the tale. And this is regulatory intermediaries. And how did it come about? We started with Rotem Medzinis, who is here, there as a PhD student. And Rotem was interested in the governing of platform in the beginning of his studies. And I was also pushing him to do EU studies, to study the EU and the way the EU govern. And we look at, in a paper called Self-Governance via Intermediaries, we looked at 3 different modes of governance, market, networks, and hierarchies. And in all of them, we could identify that central to the governance mechanisms, central to the way content moderation in this case was done, was the use of intermediaries, all kind of actors that monitored, audit the content moderation of the platforms. And of course it wasn't perfect, but the hybrid effect of using both hierarchy, market, and networks gave us a better understanding of what's going on up there in the EU and with Facebooks and other platforms. And we conceptualize this as enforced and enhanced self-regulation. So enforced self-regulation I first met, I think, in bracelet walk. But we went beyond bracelet, I think, by suggesting, and I'm saying we, but this is Rotem, we said there is something more there. This is kind of advanced, enhanced mode of self-regulation. So self-regulation is not dead, it's part of new mode of governance, different mode of governance, and it's supported by intermediaries who supply the credibility. And this was research with Rotem, and I had another students, very good students, Libby Maman. And together with Libby Maman and Yuval Maman, we really went to experimental design to study the role of intermediaries and can they bring more trust. And it's the major idea. Guess what? We were disappointed. I let you. It didn't work. It didn't work in the way we expected. So what did we do? We did the experimental survey. What is experimental survey? Surveys, you survey the people. So you take representative sample, and you divide the population to different groups. One is control group, and one is the other groups get news stories. And you ask the respondents, in this case Israeli citizens, about a few hundred people, you ask them, on which condition, under which conditions, and you give them the condition as a story to the people who answer the survey, you would trust a fintech company to give their private information, on your iPhone or phone or whatever. And we gave them all kinds of intermediaries, like internal auditor and external auditor and EU auditing or standard. And we took, what else? I don't know. It's about 6 techniques of intermediations or assurance, right? And the other groups, 7th group, altogether 7 groups, got a state regulation. And we wanted to see which kind of, say, supervision, governance, and so on will give the Israeli citizens more confidence to trust their data with the company. And it's important to trust the company, right? You want digital economy, industrial development, and so on. You don't want abuse, and this is the question, how to prevent abuse and in which way. And we wanted to see if the Israeli respondent understood the role of intermediaries. They didn't. They always, and we repeated the experience twice, they always wanted the state. And they preferred the hierarchy of the state over all kinds of enhanced self-regulation tools. So in this sense, it was disappointing. Now, is it Israel? Is it fintech? It is all these kind of issues that are making the state preferable institution over private assurances regime. I don't know. We need to go on and to check it in different countries, and we plan to do it. So I wrap it up. We live in a world that trust is very important, even if we cannot measure it. We do survey, right? I don't believe the survey is too much. Low trust countries, high trust countries. I'm skeptical. They capture something, but not everything. But I believe that without trust, regulation fail, and without regulation, trust cannot exist for long. And we need to bring both together. And our kind of goal is not cooperation or economic success only. You know, this is we are being told better rules, better growth, better trust, more cooperation, etc. Successful society. The goal is really to keep our democratic system lively, thriving, and so on. Because democracy is maybe the most important thing, for me at least. It's a normative point about the importance of administrative governance in general that combined on trust and regulation in order to continue living a fulfilling life. And it cannot be done, I believe, without democracy and without this kind of assurance regime in your language, intermediaries, etc. So I'm coming back to the first question, is Michael Moran question, if you want. Is the regulatory state a low trust state? And I said, you cannot really rule without trust. Some countries are trying to replace trust with regulation. They usually get into the illiberal type of democracies or authoritarian regimes. And you cannot really take the trust outside from the regulation. They are really in the same, built into the same institutions. And you really don't want to kill self-regulation. You want to help self-regulation, but you shouldn't kill it, because self-regulation is about autonomy, not only of you and me, but also the corporation and the citizens and so on. So I'll stop here, and I hope you enjoyed the talk. Thank you.